The first light of dawn broke over the turquoise waters of the Gilbert Islands on November 20th, 1943, casting a faint glow on the jagged coral reefs that ringed Betio, the westernmost island of Tarawa Atoll. From the vantage points of the northern cliffs and fortified pillboxes, Japanese soldiers surveyed the lagoon with a quiet confidence born of experience and terrain. They had prepared for years to repel any invasion, certain that the natural defences surrounding their island fortress would be an insurmountable obstacle for any attacking force. The coral reefs, jagged and unyielding, projected like teeth into the shallow waters, a barrier that conventional landing craft could not cross. Japanese commanders believed these reefs would serve as a first and final line of defence, forcing enemy troops to disembark under heavy fire or be crushed against the coral. Lieutenant Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, the Japanese garrison commander, had meticulously inspected the island's defences in the weeks leading up to the American assault. His men had constructed over 500 pillboxes and bunkers, reinforced with steel and concrete, each positioned to cover the beaches and approach channels. Interlocking fields of fire from machine guns, mortars, and artillery batteries would punish any attempt at landing. Anti-tank obstacles and barbed wire ran in irregular lines along the narrow beaches, funneling attackers into kill zones. Nakagawa's officers had drilled their troops repeatedly, emphasizing the lethal combination of coral, surf, and defensive firepower. From the perspective of the Japanese, any landing attempt would be a catastrophic failure for the invaders before they even touched shore. Japanese war diaries captured the sense of security in these preparations. One entry from a 3rd Battalion officer recorded, "The Americans will find the reef impassable. Any boats that approach the shallows will founder and break under fire. Betio will not fall while I command my men." This confidence, shared across ranks, was grounded in both the island's geography and prior experiences, repelling raids on other Pacific islands. The coral reefs were a natural extension of the defence network, almost a moat of stone beneath the waves. The Japanese had carefully mapped channels through which small craft might attempt to approach, but these channels were heavily mined, sown with obstacles, and under constant surveillance from observation posts. Yet, even as these men prepared for the battle they assumed inevitable, cracks in Japanese intelligence had begun to widen. Reports from scouts and intercepted communications failed to account for recent American innovations in amphibious warfare. The Marines had been training extensively with the landing vehicle tracked, the LVT, a hybrid of tank and landing craft designed specifically to traverse coral reefs. Japanese officers had heard rumours of these vehicles but dismissed them as experimental or limited in utility. Their assessments underestimated both the number of LVTs the Americans had deployed and their capabilities in surf, reef, and under fire. One captured post-war report reflected this disbelief. "We had expected the Americans to arrive in small boats, perhaps mangled rafts, but not in armoured tractors that could cross the reef and deliver men to our beaches without sinking." The coral itself was a formidable barrier. Spanning hundreds of metres in width in places, the reef emerged from the shallow lagoon in jagged ridges, with channels between that were often no more than 2 metres deep. Landing craft with conventional hulls would scrape and ground on the reef, leaving soldiers exposed to concentrated fire. Observation reports from Japanese officers during morning hours recorded that low tide would expose even more coral heads, reducing the chances of a successful amphibious approach. Many soldiers patrolled the reefs, confident in their lethal advantage. They imagined the attackers bogged down in the shallows, immobilized under the crossfire of artillery, machine guns, and mortars. The reef was, to them, as much a weapon as the guns in their pillboxes. Despite these preparations, there were hints of unease among some of the rank-and-file soldiers. In a post-war interrogation, one private confessed that whispers had circulated about strange American vehicles, metal beasts that can crawl over coral as if it were sand. While such rumours did not reach the officers' strategic calculations, they reflected a subtle acknowledgement among the men that their assumptions might be challenged. Another entry in the Japanese 4th Air Group's war diary, captured after the battle, noted frustration at their own inability to effectively scout the lagoon. Reconnaissance planes reported movements that were difficult to interpret, small shadows moving swiftly across water where none should be possible. These anomalies went largely uninvestigated due to overconfidence in the natural reef barrier. From the Allied perspective, intelligence had painted a very different picture. US planners believed that a frontal assault on Betio would be costly but achievable if combined with the correct balance of firepower, armour and innovation. After observing Japanese positions via reconnaissance planes, the Navy and Marine Corps recognized the reef as a significant obstacle, but had devised a way to overcome it with the LVT. The landing vehicles had undergone months of rigorous testing and rehearsal in Hawaii, simulating reef crossings under fire. Each LVT could carry a dozen Marines, be armed with a machine gun, and traverse the reef without grounding, delivering troops directly onto the sand. For the Japanese, the very existence of such a vehicle seemed inconceivable. Morning broke fully over Betio, and the first low-lying clouds revealed shadows on the horizon, silhouettes of Allied ships forming the invasion fleet. Japanese observers on the pillboxes scanned the waters, counting boats and estimating the impending assault. Based on prior assumptions, the majority believed the reef would force many vessels to halt or sink. Even Nakagawa's most seasoned officers underestimated the adaptability of the Americans. Diaries describe conversations among senior officers expressing certainty that any landing craft that reaches the sand will be reduced to rubble. Yet, lurking beneath this confidence was an undercurrent of tension, uneasy speculation about what these strange vehicles could accomplish. The moment of truth approached. Coral reefs, meticulously charted and assumed impassable, awaited the first wave of attackers. Artillery positions were manned, machine guns primed, and mortars readied. The Japanese defenders, disciplined and resolute, had no reason to doubt their own preparation. Yet history would soon reveal that their intelligence had failed to account for the unforeseen. The armoured LVTs, capable of rolling over the reefs, delivering men directly into the teeth of their defences, and shattering the carefully constructed illusion of an invulnerable island fortress. Even before the first shells were fired, the tension was palpable. Soldiers crouched behind sandbags, peered through periscopic sights, and awaited the assault that they believed would end with American forces trapped, exposed, and annihilated on the Coral. Yet the US Marines had learned to exploit the very feature that the Japanese considered their strongest defence. In that quiet early morning, the Coral Barrier stood majestic and menacing, a natural weapon, but one that would soon be rendered powerless against the ingenuity and engineering of the LVT. As dawn fully illuminated Betio, Japanese soldiers held their positions, unaware that the assumptions guiding their defence were about to be tested and broken, in ways no war diary, no pre-battle analysis, and no tactical manual had ever predicted. By the autumn of 1943, the United States Marine Corps had become acutely aware that the challenges of the Pacific theatre demanded innovation beyond conventional tactics. Island assaults, especially on fortified positions like Betio, required a method to deliver troops and equipment across treacherous coral reefs. The solution came in the form of the Landing Vehicle Tract, or LVT, an armoured amphibious tractor originally developed by Donald Roebling for rescue and flood relief operations in Florida. What began as a civilian invention quickly evolved into a weapon of war, a hybrid of tank and landing craft that would redefine amphibious operations in the Pacific. The LVT, nicknamed Alligator by its designers, possessed unique capabilities that made it ideal for reef crossings. Its tracked design allowed it to traverse both water and rough terrain, while its buoyant hull enabled it to float through surf without grounding. Early versions had modest armour and were lightly armed, primarily intended to ferry troops from ship to shore. However, by late 1943, improvements had produced the LVTA-1, which incorporated a mounted machine gun, reinforced armor plating, and a more powerful engine. These vehicles were no longer merely transports. They were armored spearheads capable of delivering Marines directly onto beaches under fire, circumventing the natural barriers that Japanese planners relied upon. The development of the LVT had been accelerated by hard lessons from earlier amphibious operations, including landings in the Solomon Islands. Reports from Guadalcanal, New Georgia, and Rendova demonstrated that conventional landing craft were vulnerable to enemy fire when stalled on reefs. Commanders observed troops stranded in shallow water, often pinned down under machine gun and artillery fire. The Marine Corps recognized that success in future assaults required vehicles that could cross obstacles that had previously been considered insurmountable. Engineering teams at the Philadelphia Navy Yard and the Pontiac Motor Division collaborated with the Marines to improve the LVT's flotation, armor, and engine reliability. By November 1943, these vehicles were fully operational and ready for the Betio assault. The 2nd Marine Division, assigned to the Tarawa operation, trained extensively with LVTs in the months leading up to the landing. Training exercises emphasized coordination between vehicle crews and infantry, navigation across coral reefs, and rapid disembarkation under simulated enemy fire. According to debriefings from the 13th Fighter Command and 2nd Marine Division archives, crews practiced crossing reef-like obstacles that mirrored the shallow waters of Betio. Each exercise tested the LVT's ability to maintain traction, avoid grounding, and carry troops efficiently. Crews reported that while waves could still swamp smaller landing craft, the LVTs handled surf conditions reliably, giving Marines a level of mobility previously unseen in the Pacific theater. Despite these preparations, intelligence on the Japanese side remained incomplete. Post-war interrogations and captured documents reveal that Japanese officers were aware of American amphibious training, but dismissed the possibility of large-scale armored vehicles crossing the reefs. As one Japanese private later recounted in the 1945 interrogation reports, "We had seen exercises on other islands, but we never imagined metal beasts rolling over coral, carrying men ready to fight." The perception gap was a critical factor. Japanese defenses were optimized to halt conventional craft, not armored vehicles capable of traversing obstacles previously considered impassable. On the morning of the landing, the LVTs formed the first wave of the assault, a coordinated advance spearheaded by armored tractors carrying Marines across a reef that averaged 3 feet in depth at low tide. Each vehicle carried approximately a dozen Marines, and in many cases, 1 or 2 LVTs linked together to support heavier loads. Artillery and naval gunfire had softened some of the Japanese positions, but the real advantage lay in the vehicle's ability to bypass the obstacles that would otherwise leave Marines exposed in the surf. Observers aboard the invasion fleet noted that the vehicles moved steadily across the coral, engines churning, tracks gripping the uneven surfaces with astonishing efficiency. From the Japanese perspective, the unfolding scene was almost surreal. Soldiers stationed in pillboxes and behind sandbags watched armored tractors, previously considered impossible, roll over coral reefs as if they were solid ground. Machine gunners opened fire, but many rounds struck the vehicle's armored hulls without effect. According to post-war accounts, some Japanese troops momentarily paused, unsure how to respond. One diary entry from a 1st Battalion officer stated, "They advance without sinking, without hesitation. We had thought the reef would destroy them, yet they come, rolling over the coral like spirits." The disbelief among defenders was palpable. Their assumptions about geography and battlefield dynamics were being shattered in real time. The LVTs did more than simply transport Marines. Their presence provided immediate tactical benefits. Troops could disembark in relatively organized formations, reducing the confusion that typically accompanied beach landings. Machine gunners mounted on the vehicles suppressed Japanese positions, while crew members adjusted trajectories to facilitate infantry movements. Even in areas where artillery fire was intense, LVTs maintained momentum, carrying casualties off the beaches and supplying ammunition to forward positions. For the first time in Pacific amphibious warfare, the Marines possessed a tool that allowed them to treat coral reefs not as obstacles, but as pathways directly into the heart of enemy defences. Japanese documents from the 4th Air Group and post-battle interrogations confirm the psychological impact of this unexpected mobility. Soldiers reported a profound sense of shock as the vehicles climbed over ridges, traversed channels, and disgorged Marines onto the sand with minimal delay. One post-war interview noted, "We had positioned our guns expecting the boats to halt on the reef, but the tractors rolled over everything. Our plans were useless. In essence, the reef, which had long been a natural weapon in Japan's defensive calculus, had been neutralized by American engineering and tactical innovation." The use of LVTs at Tarawa also underscored a broader evolution in amphibious doctrine. Previously, commanders had relied on naval bombardments and conventional landing craft to breach fortified islands. At Betio, the combination of naval gunfire, air support, and mechanized amphibians created a synchronized assault that forced defenders to confront multiple simultaneous threats. Intelligence failures on the Japanese side, particularly underestimating vehicle capabilities, amplified the effectiveness of this new approach. By the end of the first hour, the LVTs had secured several beach sectors, enabling infantry to move inland and neutralize pillboxes that had previously been considered impregnable. The success of the LVT at Tarawa had long-term implications. Observers from both Allied and Japanese forces recognized that amphibious assaults could no longer be planned under the assumption that reefs and natural obstacles were absolute barriers. The Marine Corps continued to refine vehicle designs, incorporating heavier armor and greater firepower, while Japanese defensive planning had to adapt to a threat that combined mobility, armor, and infantry. In retrospect, the moment when armoured tractors first rolled over the coral reefs of Betio represents not just a tactical breakthrough, but a transformation in the nature of amphibious warfare itself. By late morning on November 20th, the LVTs had achieved what Japanese planners had considered impossible: safe and efficient transport across reefs that had been their greatest natural defence. Observers on the pillboxes recorded panic, confusion, and disbelief among the defenders, as reports of armoured vehicles moving freely across the reefs filtered through command posts. The psychological shock compounded the physical threat. Soldiers who had relied on the reef to protect their flanks found themselves vulnerable to attacks from positions they had assumed safe. The ironclad amphibians, as some Marine officers later described them, had decisively rewritten the battlefield geometry of Betio. By 0900 hours on November 20th, 1943, the first wave of Marines began their descent from the LVTs onto the beaches of Betio. The sun had barely cleared the horizon, illuminating the coral ridges that Japanese planners had counted on as a natural barrier. From the pillboxes and fortified emplacements, the defenders opened fire with machine guns, mortars, and artillery, expecting to sweep the approaching landing craft before they could reach shore. What they encountered instead was a relentless stream of armoured amphibians, climbing the reefs as though the coral were mere sand. The 2nd Marine Division's landing plan had been meticulously rehearsed. Each LVT carried a complement of infantry, assigned specific sectors of the beach for assault. Officers aboard the vehicles coordinated movements through pre-arranged signals, while the vehicle crews focused on navigating the treacherous reef. According to the 2nd Marine Division debriefings and 13th Fighter Command reports, the operation's success depended on synchronization. Naval gunfire had to suppress known Japanese positions, LVTs had to maintain momentum across the reef, and infantry had to disembark in cohesive units capable of neutralizing fortified emplacements. From the Japanese perspective, the unfolding assault defied expectations. Soldiers in coastal bunkers had been briefed on the likely arrival of traditional landing craft, which would have stalled on the coral, leaving troops exposed to concentrated fire. Instead, they watched as LVTs surged over the shallow waters with astonishing speed and stability. One post-war interrogation of a Japanese private recalled the moment vividly. "We expected them to be trapped, stuck. But the metal beasts came, one after another, rolling over the coral. We could not believe our eyes. Our bullets had little effect." As the first LVTs hit the sand, Marines disembarked under fire, immediately seeking cover behind dune ridges and shell craters. The combination of armoured transport and pre-landing bombardment minimised initial casualties and allowed officers to direct troops inland with surprising efficiency. Infantry units moved in coordinated formations, supported by machine gun fire from both the LVTs and naval vessels offshore. The synergy of armour, firepower and infantry marked a tactical innovation that Japanese forces had neither anticipated nor adequately prepared for. The coral reef itself, previously seen as an impassable obstacle, now became a platform for rapid deployment. LVT crews reported climbing over ridges and navigating channels with remarkable stability, enabling Marines to disembark closer to fortified positions than ever before. According to captured Japanese documents, this was a psychological shock as much as a tactical one. Soldiers stationed in pillboxes initially hesitated, unsure how to respond to these armoured vehicles that moved freely over terrain considered defensible. One diary entry from a 1st Battalion officer read, "They advance without sinking, without hesitation. Our defensive planning is undone by machines we never thought possible." The immediate consequences were apparent. Machine gun nests, which had been positioned to cover reef approaches, were quickly overwhelmed by combined fire from LVTs and infantry. Mortar teams found it increasingly difficult to target moving armoured vehicles, and Japanese artillery, calibrated for slower, low-profile landing craft, struggled to adjust. The pace of the assault created confusion among defenders, disrupting their command and control. Reports from the 4th Air Group War Diary noted disjointed communications and an inability to coordinate effective counterattacks in response to the LVT advance. Not all LVTs crossed the reef unscathed. Some vehicles experienced mechanical issues or were struck by heavy fire, forcing crews to abandon their crafts or assist immobilized comrades. Nevertheless, the overwhelming majority maintained momentum, delivering Marines directly to the beach with minimal delay. Infantry units capitalized on the armored cover to move inland, targeting pillboxes with flamethrowers, grenades, and coordinated fire. Naval gunfire support continued from offshore, targeting artillery emplacements and reinforcing the Marine advance. For Japanese troops, the experience was transformative. Post-war interviews reveal a combination of disbelief, frustration, and strategic recalibration. One private recalled, "We had fortified the beach for months, studied the tides, the coral. Yet they rolled right over it, as if our preparations never existed." Another officer described the LVTs as like iron spirits, impervious to bullets and capable of carrying an entire company of men to our doorstep. These accounts underscore the psychological dimension of the LVT assault. It did not merely neutralize natural obstacles, it shattered assumptions that had long underpinned Japanese defensive planning. By mid-morning, the first wave had established a tenuous beachhead. The success of the LVTs allowed Marines to consolidate positions, bring forward heavier equipment, and begin coordinated assaults on key fortifications. Japanese resistance remained fierce, particularly in sectors dominated by reinforced pillboxes, but the initial shock of the armoured landing had already tilted the battlefield in favour of the Americans. Officers noted that defenders who survived the initial waves were forced into improvised countermeasures, often moving positions or firing from less optimal locations. The LVTs' ability to deliver men and firepower across previously impassable terrain disrupted defensive cohesion, creating openings that Marines exploited throughout the day. The lessons of the first wave were recorded meticulously in US after-action reports. Observers emphasized that the LVTS's success was not solely due to engineering innovation, but also careful planning, training, and coordination with naval and air support. Each vehicle acted as both transport and mobile support, bridging the gap between sea and shore with unprecedented efficiency. For Japanese defenders, the sight of armoured vehicles surmounting coral reefs became emblematic of a broader shift in Pacific warfare, an era in which technological adaptation and ingenuity could render traditional defences obsolete. As the day progressed, additional waves of LVTS followed, reinforcing the initial beachhead and pushing inland. Casualty rates, while significant, were far lower than anticipated for a conventional reef-stalled landing. Marines continued to exploit the armoured cover, methodically reducing enemy positions and expanding the perimeter. From the Japanese perspective, the disbelief expressed in early morning moments turned to grim acknowledgement. The reef, once considered a natural fortress, had failed to protect them. By evening, after nearly 12 hours of intense combat, the beachhead was secure, and Marines had gained a foothold that enabled subsequent operations across Betio. Reports highlighted the central role of the LVTS in overcoming both natural and man-made obstacles, emphasizing that the combination of armor, mobility, and tactical coordination had rewritten the rules of amphibious assault in the Pacific. Japanese accounts echoed this assessment, repeatedly noting that the landing craft, once expected to fail, had exceeded all conceivable expectations, delivering men and firepower in ways previously thought impossible. In hindsight, the first waves of LVTS at Betio illustrate a broader principle of Pacific warfare. Adaptation and technological innovation could neutralize even the most formidable natural defenses. The coral reefs that had long been considered impenetrable became conduits for attack, reshaping battlefield dynamics and challenging the assumptions of Japanese strategists. For the Marines, the success of the LVTS validated months of training, planning, and engineering, setting a precedent that would influence every subsequent amphibious operation in the Pacific theatre. By late morning on November 20th, 1943, the initial shock of the LVT landings had begun to ripple inland across Betio. Marines moved off the beaches with a disciplined momentum, their armoured transports continuing to provide cover as infantry pressed toward Japanese strongpoints. The coral reefs, once considered an insurmountable barrier, had been crossed in force, and Japanese defenders scrambled to respond to an assault for which no pre-existing plans had adequately prepared them. In the fortified western sector, pillboxes bristled with machine guns and artillery, yet Marines advanced with flamethrowers and hand grenades, using LVTS to shield their movements. Debriefings from the 2nd Marine Division highlight how coordination between armour, infantry, and naval gunfire proved decisive. Each LVT acted as both transport and mobile cover, allowing assault teams to close on emplacements while minimising exposure to Japanese fire. The combination of terrain navigation, firepower, and disciplined coordination overwhelmed defenders accustomed to slow, conventional amphibious assaults. Japanese troops, in post-war interrogations, consistently described a sense of disbelief bordering on panic. One 4th Air Group officer recounted, "Our guns could not stop them. The coral held no power over their machines. They emerged from the surf, alive and fully armed. We did not know where to focus fire." The LVT's success disrupted command chains, as officers attempted to redirect surviving troops to cover exposed sectors, often only to find Marines already positioned inside defensive lines. Despite the initial success, chaos reigned on the ground. Mortar and artillery fire occasionally fell short, striking friendly units or creating obstacles for incoming waves. LVT crews adjusted in real time, ferrying reinforcements to compromised positions and extracting casualties under fire. Coordination with naval bombardment proved critical. Forward observers guided ships' guns onto pillboxes and fortified emplacements, allowing Marines to isolate and neutralize positions systematically. By afternoon, the combination of tactical adaptability, armored mobility, and relentless infantry assaults began to unravel the Japanese defensive network. Soldiers who had pinned their hopes on the natural coral barrier faced the grim realization that their expectations were obsolete. Post-war diaries describe the psychological impact vividly. We had believed the reefs would be our shield, yet they passed over it like water. It was as if our defences were illusions. The inland advance set the stage for a broader consolidation of the beachhead. Marines capitalized on every opening created by LVT-supported assaults, securing key terrain and preparing for successive waves to penetrate deeper into Betio. The first day of the landings would prove a watershed moment in amphibious warfare, demonstrating not only the tactical value of LVTs, but also their capacity to reshape Japanese assumptions about what was defensible in the Pacific theatre. By the late morning of November 20th, 1943, the initial landings on Betio had yielded a tenuous foothold. But the real objective lay beyond the beach. The Japanese-held airfield, a critical point of defence that could control the entire atoll. Marine planners recognized that seizing it quickly would prevent the Japanese from regrouping or mounting effective counterattacks, yet the path inland was fraught with both natural and man-made obstacles. Coral ridges, dense sand, and interlocking fields of fire from pillboxes, artillery emplacements, and hidden machine gun nests slowed progress. It was here that the role of the LVTs, previously underestimated by Japanese intelligence, would become even more pronounced. The first wave of Marines had already demonstrated the LVT's unique ability to traverse reefs and shallow waters that had stymied conventional landing craft. Now, inland, the LVTs continued to serve as mobile artillery platforms, troop carriers, and shields against direct fire. Debriefing reports from the 2nd Marine Division note that LVT crews adapted quickly to terrain obstacles, using coral outcroppings as cover while ferrying reinforcements, ammunition, and even wounded soldiers back to makeshift beach medevac stations. The synergy between LVT mobility and infantry firepower created a pace of advance the Japanese defenders could neither anticipate nor counter effectively. In the western sector, Marines encountered pillboxes that had been oriented to cover the beaches and shallow approaches. Their interlocking fields of fire were rendered partially ineffective by LVT-borne assault teams approaching from unexpected angles. Flamethrower squads, supported by riflemen and machine gunners riding the LVTs, neutralized emplacements in rapid succession. The combination of firepower, armor, and speed allowed assault groups to penetrate deeper inland than Japanese planners had deemed possible. Post-war interrogations of Japanese officers frequently reference this moment with disbelief. One officer recalled, "We had fortified the approach to the airfield, yet the Americans moved over coral and sand with ease, striking positions we considered secure. It was as though the reefs themselves had betrayed us." Meanwhile, in the central sector, Marines coordinated closely with naval gunfire. Observers perched on LVTs relayed real-time coordinates to battleships and cruisers offshore, enabling precise bombardments that suppressed Japanese artillery and machine gun nests ahead of the advancing infantry. These combined arms tactics demonstrated a level of coordination rarely seen in previous amphibious operations. LVTs were no longer merely landing vehicles. They were command platforms that amplified the Marines' ability to adapt to the chaotic battlefield conditions. The Japanese defenders responded with a mixture of fire and improvisation. Artillery units attempted to redirect shells to intercept the LVTs, but the Marines' speed and maneuverability often rendered these efforts ineffective. Small arms fire proved similarly futile, with armour plating and sheer numbers of assault teams overwhelming positions faster than the defenders could react. Some Japanese soldiers resorted to desperate close-quarters engagements, throwing grenades at the armoured vehicles or attempting to use satchel charges. While occasionally effective in disabling single vehicles, These acts were sporadic and insufficient to stem the tide. By mid-afternoon, Marines had secured several key positions along the path to the airfield. LVTs continued to ferry fresh troops and supplies directly to the front lines, bypassing terrain that would have required hours of foot movement under fire. Combat engineers followed closely, clearing obstacles, creating improvised roads, and marking coral hazards, enabling the LVTs to maintain momentum. This logistical adaptability proved decisive. Without continuous support, inland advances would have slowed, giving Japanese forces time to regroup or reinforce critical positions. Psychologically, the impact on Japanese defenders was profound. War diaries and post-war testimonies consistently described the shock of witnessing amphibious vehicles traverse coral reefs and reach positions that were previously considered unreachable. Soldiers reported confusion, fear, and a pervasive sense of inevitability, realizing that the natural barrier they had relied upon was no longer a defense. The LVTs, combined with well-coordinated infantry and artillery, had shattered assumptions about what constituted secure territory on Betio. One entry from a captured diary reads, "Our emplacements were built to withstand landings, but nothing could withstand these machines moving through. The coral like rivers of iron." As the sun dipped toward late afternoon, the Marines approached the outskirts of the airfield. Japanese troops, many reduced to remnants after the morning and early afternoon engagements, mounted increasingly disorganized resistance. Ammunition shortages, communication breakdowns, and the relentless advance of LVT-supported forces compounded the chaos. The field itself was heavily mined and covered with obstacles, yet LVTs were able to transport demolition teams and flamethrower units directly onto the approaches, neutralizing defenses and opening paths for infantry to occupy the airfield with minimal exposure. The seizure of the airfield by late afternoon marked a turning point in the battle for Betio. LVTs had proved indispensable not only in overcoming natural obstacles like reefs and coral ridges, but also in maintaining the momentum of an inland assault against heavily fortified positions. Their ability to transport troops, provide mobile cover, and serve as command and supply platforms allowed the Marines to penetrate the core of Japanese defences more rapidly than traditional doctrine had predicted. Post-war analyses emphasise that without the LVT, the operation would have faced significantly higher casualties and potentially delayed success by days. Ultimately, the inland advance to the airfield on November 20th demonstrated a fundamental shift in amphibious warfare. The Japanese had expected to leverage natural terrain and pre-established fortifications to hold the island. Instead, the LVTs, originally underestimated in intelligence reports, enabled the Marines to rewrite the rules of engagement, combining mobility, firepower, and logistical support in ways the defenders had not anticipated. For the first time, the coral reefs of Betio were no longer barriers but mere obstacles to be overcome, a reality that profoundly altered Japanese defensive calculations for the remainder of the Pacific campaign. As night fell on Betio on November 20th, 1943, the battle had reached a critical juncture. The Marines had secured a tenuous foothold inland and captured portions of the airfield, yet the Japanese defenders were far from defeated. Darkness brought with it the potential for devastating counterattacks, as Japanese troops, reinforced and reoriented after the day's chaos, attempted to reclaim lost positions. The night of November 20th to 21st would test the adaptability of both men and machines, particularly the LVTs, whose unique capabilities would again prove decisive. Japanese forces had anticipated that nighttime operations could exploit the limited visibility to inflict significant casualties on the Marines. Patrols, small infantry units, and demolition teams were prepared to infiltrate weak points along the perimeter, targeting supply lines and communication nodes. In pre-battle planning, the Japanese considered the inland coral ridges and irregular terrain as natural channels through which they could funnel attacks. However, the LVTs's continued presence on Betio rendered many of these assumptions obsolete. The vehicles were not only capable of transporting reinforcements quickly, but also served as mobile defensive positions against assaults, providing firepower and observation in terrain that would have otherwise favoured the attackers. Reports from the 13th Fighter Command debriefings indicate that Japanese counterattacks began shortly after sundown, focusing on sectors where marine lines were thin and exhausted from continuous combat. Small groups emerged from the dense terrain around the airfield and attempted to breach the perimeter with grenades, satchel charges, and concentrated small arms fire. LVT crews, already accustomed to facing hostile fire during daylight landings, adapted quickly. Vehicles were strategically positioned along probable avenues of approach, and Marines disembarked to create overlapping fields of fire, using the armour and mobility of the LVTs as both cover and staging platforms. One notable engagement occurred along the western approach to the airfield. Japanese infantry, numbering approximately 50 men, attempted a coordinated night attack on a forward Marine LVT position. The defenders, relying on spotlights, flares, and improvised illumination, used the LVTs as both shields and firing platforms. Mounted machine guns, rifle teams, and even portable mortars suppressed enemy advances, while the vehicle's mobility allowed rapid repositioning to counter shifts in the assault. Post-battle reports described the LVTs as iron walls in motion, capable of delivering both sustained fire and swift tactical response. Elsewhere, Japanese sappers sought to disable LVTs directly. Teams armed with satchel charges and improvised explosive devices attempted to infiltrate the perimeter undetected. On multiple occasions, these units were intercepted by Marine patrols transported via LVTs, whose speed allowed rapid redeployment along threatened sectors. The vehicles' armoured hulls withstood small arms fire, and their weight made them resilient against limited explosives. These incidents were recorded in both US after-action reports and post-war Japanese accounts, which describe astonishment at the vehicle's durability under concentrated attack. Communication between LVT crews and command elements proved essential during the night's engagements. Marines used radios mounted on the vehicles to relay intelligence about enemy movement, enabling artillery units offshore to adjust fire in near real time. This coordination resulted in targeted barrages against Japanese infiltration groups, further degrading their capacity to organize effective counterattacks. The combination of mobile firepower, armored protection, and integrated command and control made LVT-supported units exceptionally resilient during nighttime combat. Psychologically, the presence of the LVTs had a significant impact on both sides. Japanese soldiers repeatedly expressed disbelief in post-war interrogations, noting that the vehicles appeared suddenly, in any place we tried to attack, carrying reinforcements and firepower we could not anticipate. For the Marines, LVTs offered a rare sense of security amidst the chaos of night fighting. Crews often described the vehicles as life-saving platforms, capable of bridging exposed terrain while providing cover and rapid extraction in emergencies. The ability to move along coral ridges and irregular ground without becoming trapped fundamentally changed tactical options for Marine commanders. By early morning on November 21st, Japanese forces had largely exhausted their capacity to mount organized night assaults. While sporadic attacks continued, the LVTs allowed Marines to rapidly reinforce threatened sectors, deliver ammunition, evacuate wounded, and maintain uninterrupted pressure on key objectives. One particular unit, operating along the northern perimeter of the airfield, successfully repelled multiple attacks with minimal casualties, directly attributing their defensive success to the speed, armour, and firepower provided by LVT support. After-action reports emphasize that without LVT mobility, many sectors would have been overwhelmed by superior numbers during darkness. The night's engagements also underscored the importance of combined arms integration. LVTs were not operating in isolation. they functioned in concert with infantry, engineers, artillery, and naval gunfire support. Observers note that their contribution extended beyond simple transportation. They became flexible tools for battlefield management, bridging gaps between units, sustaining morale, and allowing rapid adaptation to unpredictable threats. This multifunctional role transformed the vehicles from specialized amphibious craft into indispensable components of inland combat operations, a shift that would influence marine doctrine in subsequent Pacific campaigns. By dawn, the effectiveness of the night's defense was clear. The Marines retained control of the airfield perimeter, casualties were contained relative to the intensity of the engagement, and Japanese forces had been forced to retreat to secondary defensive positions. Post-war analyses highlighted that the successful defense was in large part due to the LVTS's continued operational presence, allowing for rapid counter-movements, mobile firepower, and the reinforcement of key positions under fire. Japanese diaries and memoirs, captured and translated, often described this period with a tone of incredulity, noting the resilience and tactical innovation of the Marines, facilitated by vehicles that rolled over coral and obstacles as if the island itself were yielding to them. The lessons of this night extended beyond Betio. Marine planners and combat engineers would study these engagements to refine amphibious tactics, emphasizing the integration of armored landing vehicles in both initial assaults and inland defensive operations. The night counterattacks demonstrated that LVTS could extend the offensive power of Marines far beyond the beachhead, fundamentally challenging Japanese assumptions about static island defenses. Coral reefs and prepared positions, once considered reliable deterrents, had been rendered largely irrelevant in the face of mobile, armoured support. As November 21st broke, the Marines prepared to press further inland, consolidating gains and preparing for the final phases of Betio's capture. The night's combat had proven the LVTS enduring value, not merely as transport over obstacles, but as vital instruments of firepower, command, and psychological dominance. Japanese forces, already reeling from daylight assaults, now faced an enemy whose operational reach extended far beyond what they had imagined, solidifying the transformation of amphibious warfare tactics in the Pacific theatre. By the morning of November 21st, 1943, the Marines had consolidated their positions on Betio, yet large swaths of the island remained firmly in Japanese hands. The western beaches, though less fortified than the heavily defended eastern approach, still contained a network of pillboxes, machine gun nests, and concealed artillery positions. These fortifications, positioned to cover the narrow sandy beaches and coral ridges, had already repelled earlier amphibious assaults from conventional landing craft. What remained a formidable obstacle was the coral reef, once considered impassable, which the Marines now intended to cross once again, with LVTS leading the assault. The strategic objective was clear: secure the western beachhead to prevent Japanese forces from regrouping and launching flanking attacks on Marine positions inland. LVTS, often called amtracs by their crews, formed the spearhead of the attack. Unlike traditional Higgins boats, these amphibious vehicles could traverse the coral at high tide and deliver troops directly onto the contested beach. Their armour allowed them to absorb small arms fire, while mounted machine guns suppressed Japanese defensive positions. For many Japanese soldiers, the sight of these vehicles moving steadily over what they considered impassable reefs was demoralizing. Post-war interrogations recorded their astonishment, with one officer noting, "We could not believe our eyes. The enemy came over the coral as if it were sand." Marine planners had studied aerial reconnaissance photographs and intelligence reports meticulously. While previous attempts to breach the West Beach had been stymied by hidden coral ridges, engineers coordinated with LVT crews to navigate submerged obstacles. In some sectors, LVTS drove straight over the reef crest, dislodging sand and coral while delivering Marines directly to the base of pillboxes. In others, vehicles provided flanking fire to suppress machine guns, while infantry disembarked to assault the fortifications. The combination of mobility, firepower, and armour allowed the Marines to neutralise positions that would have been lethal with foot assault alone. One engagement, documented in the 2nd Battalion Action Report, highlighted the tactical innovation of combining LVT mobility with coordinated artillery. As a Japanese pillbox opened fire on the advancing LVTs, crews quickly returned fire with mounted 30-caliber machine guns. Simultaneously, forward observers relayed coordinates to naval gunfire support ships offshore. Explosions shook the pillbox, forcing Japanese defenders to abandon their positions. Within minutes, Marines disembarked from LVTs and moved in to secure the emplacement. This precise integration of land, sea, and mobile armoured units exemplified the evolution of amphibious tactics that would define the Pacific campaigns. The psychological impact of these assaults cannot be overstated. Japanese troops, entrenched in fortified positions with lines of sight over the beach and coral, had expected conventional landing craft to be stopped cold. Yet LVTs defied expectations, appearing seemingly at will across the reef, delivering firepower and fresh troops. Post-war memoirs and interrogation transcripts reflect repeated incredulity. One private recalled, "They came out of the water like monsters. No matter where we fired, more of them kept coming." The repeated exposure to an unstoppable armoured enemy not only depleted morale, but also caused confusion in command and coordination among the defenders. Not all engagements proceeded without cost. LVTs were vulnerable to heavy artillery and concealed anti-tank weapons, and some vehicles were disabled by direct hits. Casualties among the crews were inevitable, though the armour of the vehicles significantly reduced fatalities compared to infantry moving over exposed beaches. The Marines had developed rapid recovery protocols, using undamaged LVTs to evacuate the wounded and reposition fire teams. These lessons, painstakingly learned on the beaches of Betio, would inform future operations at Guam, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Japanese defensive doctrine had emphasized static fortifications reinforced by natural obstacles. The belief that reefs would halt amphibious assaults was pervasive, informed by previous experiences at islands where conventional landing craft had failed. On Betio, however, this assumption was fatally flawed. The US Marine Corps had studied Japanese defensive patterns and exploited the combination of high tide windows, LVT mobility, and coordinated firepower. By the end of the West Beach assault, the Marines had cleared multiple pillbox lines, secured the beachhead, and forced Japanese units to retreat into inland positions. Throughout the operation, communication remained critical. LVT crews used mounted radios to coordinate with both artillery observers and infantry units, creating a dynamic battlefield where movement, suppression, and reinforcement could occur almost simultaneously. Intelligence reports later emphasized that this integrated approach made Japanese countermeasures largely ineffective. Units attempting to counterattack were often met with concentrated fire from LVTs, machine guns, and supporting artillery in a way that seemed to anticipate their movements. Japanese war diaries frequently note this unpredictability, describing the Marines' unrelenting advance as a combination of superior technology, coordination, and tactical daring. By late afternoon, the western beach was largely secured, providing a critical staging area for further inland operations. LVTs continued to shuttle reinforcements, evacuate casualties, and provide mobile firepower. The Marines had not only overcome the natural coral obstacles, but had also demonstrated the practical advantage of mechanized amphibious assault in reducing exposure and accelerating operational tempo. For Japanese forces, the loss of the West Beach marked a turning point. Positions that had been considered defensible now lay vulnerable, and retreat became the only viable option for survival. The effectiveness of LVTs in these final assaults reshaped tactical thinking for both sides. For the US forces, the vehicles were validated as essential for any high-casualty amphibious operation, especially against islands with coral reefs and prepared fortifications. For Japanese forces, the realization that reefs were no longer insurmountable barriers forced an immediate reconsideration of defensive strategy. Post-war analyses frequently cite the Betio landings as a watershed moment where traditional assumptions about static island defense were fundamentally challenged by mechanized amphibious capability. By nightfall, Marines on the western sector could begin consolidating positions, preparing for the final clearance of central and southern portions of Betio. The assault on the West Beach had been costly but decisive. LVTs had transformed the beachhead from a perilous landing into a manageable operational zone. The combination of mobility, firepower, and tactical flexibility had allowed Marines to achieve objectives that had been deemed nearly impossible just days before. Japanese defenders, now increasingly confined to isolated positions, faced the reality that the island could no longer serve as a fortress impervious to amphibious attack. As post-battle reports summarized, the LVTS's contribution was more than logistical. It was decisive in shaping the operational tempo and survivability of assaulting units. In the annals of amphibious warfare, the West Beach assault demonstrated the unique capacity of mechanized amphibious vehicles to overcome natural obstacles, fortifications, and entrenched defensive doctrine. The events of November 21, 1943, on Betio's western shore, thus became a defining moment in the Pacific Campaign, one that highlighted both the ingenuity of marine planning and the unanticipated psychological and tactical impact on Japanese defenders. By November 22, 1943, Betio Island was a battlefield strewn with the wreckage of war, burned-out tanks, shattered pillboxes, and the remnants of coral defences that had once seemed impenetrable. The eastern and western beaches had been partially secured, but Japanese forces continued to resist fiercely from fortified positions in the island's interior and along its southern perimeter. For US Marines, the objective was now clear: complete the seizure of Betio, neutralize remaining strongpoints, and establish the island as a secure foothold for further operations in the Gilbert Islands. The final sweep required a coordinated application of infantry, artillery, and mechanized support. LVTs, which had proven decisive on both the eastern and western beaches, were again called into action, this time as mobile fire platforms and troop carriers for inland operations. Their ability to traverse the remaining coral ridges, shallow ponds, and debris-strewn terrain allowed the Marines to outflank Japanese positions that had resisted conventional frontal assaults. For the Japanese defenders, the continued presence of LVTs on the battlefield was unnerving. Their fortifications, designed to counter static landings, were now vulnerable to highly mobile mechanized forces capable of delivering concentrated fire at unexpected angles. One of the most challenging objectives was a network of pillboxes and machine gun nests along the southern approach to the island's airfield. These positions had been constructed with reinforced concrete and protected by overlapping fields of fire. Japanese soldiers, trained in delaying tactics, were determined to hold these positions to the last man, using the natural coral ridges as both cover and observation posts. US intelligence reports had noted the concentration of defenders, and planners devised a combined approach: suppressive fire from naval artillery, LVT-mounted machine guns, and infantry assaults supported by flamethrowers and demolition teams. As dawn broke, LVTs loaded with infantry moved over the final coral barriers. Some vehicles provided direct fire support with their mounted 50 caliber and 30 caliber machine guns, while others carried engineers tasked with demolishing pillboxes. The synchronized approach, a tactic honed over the past 3 days of brutal combat, minimized exposure to Japanese fire and maintained constant pressure on the defenders. Observers noted that the psychological impact of these armored amphibians continued to be significant. Soldiers entrenched in concrete bunkers reportedly abandoned their positions upon seeing the LVTs advancing, recognizing that traditional defensive methods were increasingly ineffective. Despite the overwhelming mechanized support, casualties continued to mount. Japanese artillery and mortars inflicted losses on exposed LVTs, and some vehicles became bogged down in the uneven terrain, necessitating rapid recovery efforts by accompanying units. Nevertheless, the speed, firepower, and protective armour of the LVTs allowed Marine forces to maintain momentum. Infantry units, deployed directly from the vehicles, were able to engage the defenders immediately, reducing the time Japanese forces had to regroup or counterattack. A notable engagement occurred near the southern airfield, where a reinforced pillbox complex had delayed the assault for hours. LVTs approached under covering fire from naval bombardments, providing a combination of suppression and mobile assault capability. Engineers disembarked under the protection of armoured vehicles and placed demolition charges at the base of the bunkers. The explosions tore through the concrete, neutralising the positions and allowing infantry to secure the area. This action, repeated across multiple strongpoints, exemplified the tactical synergy between LVT mobility, firepower, and combined arms coordination. Throughout the final sweep, communication remained a key factor in operational success. LVT crews, infantry leaders, and artillery observers maintained constant contact via radio, ensuring that fire missions could be adjusted dynamically and that troop movements remained coordinated. Japanese defenders, cut off from effective communication by the destruction of command posts and the chaos of battle, were increasingly isolated. Post-war interrogation reports described the despair among Japanese units as they witnessed LVTs maneuvering over the reefs, delivering infantry, and coordinating with artillery in ways that defied their expectations. By midday, resistance had begun to collapse. Japanese forces were increasingly confined to isolated pockets of defenders in the central and southern portions of Betio. LVTs continued to ferry reinforcements, evacuate wounded Marines, and provide fire support. The continuous pressure, combined with the overwhelming firepower of the amphibious vehicles and supporting arms, prevented Japanese units from reorganizing or mounting significant counterattacks. Observers noted that the final stages of the battle demonstrated not only the physical utility of the LVTs, but also their strategic impact in undermining Japanese defensive doctrine, which had assumed that static fortifications and natural barriers would dictate the pace of battle. By evening, Betio was fully under Allied control. LVTs had neutralized reefs and fortifications, delivering troops, supplies, and firepower directly onto the beaches. Marines credited them with enabling rapid advances and maintaining operational momentum, while Japanese forces were stunned by their effectiveness. The battle demonstrated the transformative power of mechanized amphibious operations, reshaping Pacific amphibious doctrine. LVTs became symbols of mobility, survival, and offensive power, marking Betio as a testament to innovation, courage, and adaptability that would influence U.S. operations at Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and beyond.